Hello, welcome to Picture Me Coding with Erik and Mike Mall. Mike, my friend, how you doing?
I'm doing okay. It's a nice fall day in San Diego.
It's pleasant outside. It's sunny, no clouds. Well, actually, I see one cloud. What have you been listening to, Mike?
So I wanted to preface this by saying that I kind of like country music, which I know is a stretch for a lot of people. You always hear people say I like all kinds of music except country music. You know, I grew up on a farm in Indiana, and
Yeah, a lot
my
of
dad,
cowboys in Indiana, right?
not exactly, lots of
Oh,
cows
lots of
and
cows.
lots of boys, but anyway, my dad's pickup truck. This was back in it was a 1970 something pickup truck. It only had AM radio, and there were only two stations we could get, one of which was this kind of famous local radio station called WOWO, which was a weird combination of farm reports and top 40 music. And then the other station was the country music station. So I ended up listening to a lot of country music, and I actually kind of like a lot of it, and I still do. But on the other hand, when I go to Spotify and I listen to the hot country songs, the playlist they have, it just doesn't sound like country music to me. It sounds sort of like, pop music that where the singer has a little bit of a twang.
Yeah, it sounds like to me that I read that as like an extreme masochistic jaunt through just like artificiality.
Yeah, and there's all these tropes, it's every time somebody's uses the phrase fishing hole, I immediately skip that song because I know it's going to be bullshit. Or they talk about their pickup truck or how country folk are so much more, you know, sincere and honest than city folk. And I'm like, yeah, this is just formulaic. But anyway, long story short, the thing I've been listening to recently is this album by a guy named Charlie Overman, who lives in Kentucky, apparently. It's like straight country music. This is not like some indie band that, has a little bit of a Americana twist to it. This is pretty country music, and
Mm.
it's got, country themes about, you know, farming and pickup trucks and hunting and stuff like that. But I really like it. It's good music. It's interesting lyrics, very frequently funny. There's a couple of really memorable lines. There's this thing about he and his friends get drunk and they go to a punk bar and he sees limes in the urinal, which just cracks me up. And one of my favorite songs on here is this song. It's about hanging out with his friends, but the title of the song is Canada Thistle, and so the reason is because it's got this. The chorus is this line about these people will be my friends as long as the Canada Thistle continues to spread, which I thought was a very like country rural thing to pick up on because if you grew up in the country like I did, you're always kind of battling the Canada thistle, and it it's sort of an invasive plant that has spread throughout the Midwest. But
Hmm.
anyway, I really like this album, but it's definitely a country album. So, if you don't like Hank Williams or Patsy Cline, you probably won't like this either.
I like Patsy Cline. Hank Williams, I kind of okay passing on. I keep listening to this record from 2011 by a Swedish band called Graveyard. The album's called High Singin' Blues. It's new to me, even though it's from 2011. And I don't know, I stumbled upon it because of my Slow Mosa pursuit a couple weeks ago. I got recommended this thing and I was like, what is this? And immediately I was like, when did they make this? It sounds like it came straight out of 1969. Normally that would turn me off quite a lot because it's like a pastiche thing. Like we're just going to retread ground we've already been over. But when I heard this record, I was like, oh my God, I feel like I really need this. I have to have this thing. It's really bluesy. It's really Led Zeppelin-y. It's really good, actually. I recommend it. It's pretty straight ahead, rock and roll type of record. It's fun to listen to.
I did listen to this one. I liked it too. I would agree with the Zeppelin assessment.
It's kind of surprising how it grabs you, isn't it? Your initial response is like, I don't think I would like this, but Why is it holding me so tightly?
Yeah, it is. It is very listenable. There's this thing with music like this. What was that band from like 20 years ago? There's always this trick with bands like this where trying to recreate that sound, you sort of cross over into being imitative and kind
Hmm.
of uh, kind of a little bit
A pastiche, I would say.
derivative. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, it just
Um,
doesn't feel that. It feels lame. Like if I say, "Oh, this album, this band reminds me of Led Zeppelin," in a kind of pastiche way, my response to me telling me that would be, "Well, that sounds super lame."
yeah. But this I don't think does that. I think it's got enough of its own thing going on to be pretty good.
Mike, I woke up the other day from my alarm, and I had this thought in my head immediately as the alarm was going off. And the thought was, "I need to get out of my bed. Someone's trying to sell my bed right now." And then I opened my eyes and realized the alarm was going off, and I went, "Oh, nobody's selling my bed. That's not happening." I hate waking up to the alarm. Most days I don't wake up to the alarm. I just wake up naturally. Anyway, so I woke up to the alarm that day. It sucked. And I apologize if there are people out there listening to us who wake up to the alarm every day. I prefer not to. I prefer organic, natural wake up time. Anyway, that evening, I watched an episode of the PBS program Nova, and it was about quantum mechanics. The name of the episode was Decoding the Universe, actually. It was a pretty good episode. And in that episode, they started talking about how quantum mechanics is an incredible discovery early part of the 20th century and ended up affecting our lives in really dramatic ways. And I was like, oh, I wonder what they're going to talk about. Nuclear power. And actually, they started talking about GPS. And then they started talking about time. And they started talking about cesium clocks. And they had this whole description of the cesium clock. And I found this compelling. And it made me think, wow, Mike and I, we did that episode about time a few weeks ago. We should revisit that. We promised we were going to come back and talk about some of the aspects of time that frustrate us as programmers. I think we should do that today. What do you think, Mike?
That sounds like a pretty good plan to me. I don't think we should try to explain quantum mechanics, but
You probably are not going to be surprised to hear this, but I am unqualified to do that.
yes, I also am unqualified to do it, despite having studied it on multiple occasions. So,
Every time someone at work says to me, "Hey, in your program, if we can't do X, can we just schedule it for a month in the future?" I find myself just sort of they'll respond to whatever look I'm giving them in this disappointed way. Apparently, my look says, "Well, that's kind of hard," and then I start asking a bunch of questions, and it's like one of those moments of so many at work where you're talking to someone who's not a software developer, and they're looking at you like, "Why are you so weird? Why is it so hard for you to do something that's so easy? I want a thing to happen a month from now. Why is that so hard?"
yeah, it's frustrating as the respondent also to have to say, "Could you clarify what you mean by a month?"
It's one of those conversations that makes people hate dealing with software developers, I think. They just don't it's another one of those things like dealing with money where the human world has agreed upon notions of what these things mean. And when they show up to us, they want us to translate it into software and we start throwing roadblocks in the way. And it's surprisingly like we look kind of inept, I think.
Yeah, it's you kind of want to explain that, look, I know what a month is, but I have to explain to the computer what a month is. So I need you to be very specific about what you mean by a month.
And then you start talking about leap seconds, and people get really pissed off.
Yeah, leap seconds. Yeah, so I guess one reason we wanted to do this is because, last time we talked about time, it was sort of a little bit more abstractly in terms of, the development of UTC and dealing with leap seconds and atomic clocks and all that stuff. And we only sort of skimmed the parts about how programmers actually use time in software.
And sources of frustration.
Right. Yeah. And the sources of frustration around that. So you gave one example is, what do you mean by doing something a month in the future? But there's all sorts of different ways that we use time in software. Sometimes it's just because human beings want to see when something was created or when something was modified, or the
Timestamps.
yeah timestamps. But there might also be compliance regimes that require you to put timestamps or other types of auditing information. Like you need to, when somebody makes a change to something, you need to say such and such a user made this change at this time, so that you can go back and actually provide that to auditors if necessary.
Mm-hmm.
We use it on data quite often so that you can use the time as a filter, use it in queries. So,
Yeah,
you
I
know,
read the Snowflake paper yesterday, and they were talking about how that's one of the most common filters in the queries they see.
yeah, so it's very common to put a, fairly precise timestamp on data so you can query for it or aggregate by time. We've used it a lot in like what you're saying there, do something in a month. We do that quite often to trigger certain things to happen. So
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
somebody creates a record and nothing happens to it for 30 days, and then maybe we archive that record, or we send out a message saying, hey, nobody's looked at this, should somebody look at
Mm-hmm.
this. It comes up in scheduling, both the sort of type of scheduling you were talking about earlier, of run something 30 days from now, or
Like
run
a
some,
cron job.
yeah, like a cron job, run something every night, or run something every 5 minutes. But there's also like CPU scheduling, where you're trying to keep track of how much time a particular process has run, so that you can put it on the CPU or take it off the CPU and give some other thing a chance.
Right. In those cases, it's divided up in 100 millisecond time slices usually.
Yeah, so it has to be very precise in that case, and you want it to be consistent in the sense you don't want your clock to drift too much.
Mm-hmm.
We use time for ordering things. You see that a lot in distributed systems.
Yeah.
The
Yeah. Which event happened before which other one? Yeah. And then the Lamport's clock paper with the happens before relation.
And then we use it for measuring certain things. So, like the whole GPS system is kind of based on how long does what is the time it takes to get a signal from a set of satellites, and you can use that information to figure out where you're at. I guess another example that I thought of was the ICMP protocol that is used for ping. Ping is typically just used to see if something is there, but it also gives you a round trip time
Mm-hmm.
data to tell you how quickly something is responding. So
People
anyway,
don't talk about ping much. I always open up a terminal and ping if I think my network might be misbehaving.
yeah, ping and traceroute are kind of like I don't know, they're almost like reflexive responses to when you're thinking the network is broken. But
That's your networking multi-tool that you pull out of your pocket.
yeah, even if you don't have any evidence that that's a problem, it just feels like you should do it for some reason. But
Yeah, yeah. So time, I think all those things you mentioned, those are all valid reasons why we need to use time. But what it says to me overall, the overall picture I get from that is, it's not just this background thing. It's not just an afterthought. It's not just, oh, this happened and then I'll take a timestamp. It's like a key component of a vast number of programs to know accurately what the time is.
yeah, and I think you could probably even make the case that software sort of broadly has driven the need to have precise and agreed upon times.
That's interesting. Why do you say that?
Well, originally people started to sort of make time conform because they were trying to do things like keep train schedules in order and stuff like that. But I think the use of the development of things like universal coordinated time, or UTC, has been really driven over the last 50 years by the need for things like coordinating timestamps on satellites and cell phones and distributed applications and stuff like that. And when I say software, I mean that pretty broadly in terms of like embedded stuff and so forth. But um,
Mm.
really, the need for precise and consistent timekeeping has really been driven by technology, I think.
So precise and consistent. There's like important aspects to when I reach for a timestamp, I think, is what you're saying.
Yeah, I mean, all of these things that we talked about, the way in which we use time imply certain things about timekeeping on computers. So typically if you are, when you are writing software and you need to know, you look at a timestamp on data and you need to know how that compares to the current time. Typically, you're just going to pull the time from that computer. So there's going to be some system call that will return you the current time, which implies certain things. One of which is the time on your computer is set correctly.
Yeah. Cross my fingers. Hope it is.
If you're, say, dealing in a distributed application on a network, that the time on your computer is somehow consistent with the time on the other computers.
Yeah. Yeah. We're talking wall clock time, right? In Lamport's paper, he makes a distinction in wall clock time, monotonic clocks, where you just start incrementing, chick, 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 and then Lamport clocks, which are his creation, which I don't think we're talking about here, but we're talking wall clock time in general, right? We want to agree upon time in the whole world.
Yeah, wall clock time, although it may be, some abstraction like the seconds since the beginning of the epoch, seconds since 1970 or something like that. But
I got one of those clocks on my wall.
Cool. Does it help? I mean, do you know what time it is by looking at it?
No, anytime someone says what time it is, I have to convert. And by the time I've done converting, seconds already passed, Mike. It sucks, these clocks.
Yeah, we're mostly talking about wall clock time, and another complication of wall clock time is that wall clock time for me is not necessarily the same as wall clock time for somebody in Utah.
So you're talking time zones. So we've got, my computer may or may not be accurate when I ask it what time it is. It may not be, it's accurate, but maybe the other computers it's talking to are not accurate, or vice versa. And now we've got the introduction of time zones, everyone's favorite detail about dealing with time.
Yeah, we'll get into time zones later, but they are remarkably annoying. I guess there's also an implication for some of these uses that the time that you are provided and the time that you can get on your computer is precise enough that you can actually tell the difference between, what happened before another thing. So,
Oh, interesting.
and like maybe as a layman, you might think that time down to the seconds is sufficient for that, but it very rarely is. Very often you are dealing with things that are milliseconds or even microseconds apart, and you need to hope that, the time you have on your data is consistent with the time that you have on your computer, and also that, that's consistent down to microseconds.
I in the past I've heard people say you're only going to get, if you're looking at wall clock time, you're not really going to get accurate below a handful of milliseconds most of the time. Maybe that's not accurate anymore, but that used to be the case. So if I have timestamps that are within a handful of milliseconds of each other, it's a wash. Which one happened before? I just sort of throw up my hands.
Yeah, that's definitely true if you're dealing with the typical time synchronization protocols, because they're really only capable of keeping things in sync to millisecond level.
Yeah, there's physical properties that limit what we can do here, right? I mean, if I'm going to go out over the network and talk to some other server, it takes time to do that. And yet time is a thing I want to try to figure out. So I'm kind of working against myself here.
Yeah, and the other thing that we talked about in the last episode about time, which is kind of counterintuitive, I think, is that you have these pretty precise electronic timekeeping things on individual computers, but they do drift. If you have two separate computers, they may drift in different ways. So there needs to be some way to, if you have a set of computers, there needs to be some way to keep them somehow synchronized to within some tolerance. And that also implies that somewhere out there is a correct version of what time it currently is, which is largely what we talked about in the last episode with atomic clocks and coordinated universal time.
That's the part that kind of scrambles my brain a little bit, because it sounds to me like you're hinting also at special relativity. If I'm at work and we're discussing some feature we want to build and they're lopping a complexity on, and I'm like, okay, it'll take a while to do that. It'll take a while to do that. It'll take a while to do that. And then someone at the table says, but we also must consider special relativity. That's the point at which I'm like, okay, I'm going to stand up and quit. I'm going to go find a different. I don't, I don't, can I just ignore that, please?
I think in most, earthbound applications, you can ignore it. I think there's probably some cases where you can't. I remember reading a paper like 10 years ago about what the outer limits of high frequency trading were because of the, you know, the implications of relativity. But I think in most cases, if you're dealing with stuff on the Earth, you can ignore relativity, but you may have to have a more precise synchronization protocol in some cases. However, as we mentioned briefly in the last episode, the European Space Agency and NASA are starting to work on what they call something like lunar coordinated time. So they're trying to set up a time standard for the moon so that when we start to colonize the moon, ships going up there and software running up there will be able to keep in sync. But there you do have to worry about relativity because the atomic clocks will be slightly different than they are on Earth because of relativistic effects. So,
I'm a run-of-the-mill programmer. Most of the time I don't have to deal with this stuff, right? Most of the time I don't have to deal with timestamps that are closer together than a few milliseconds. If they are within a few milliseconds, I could just sort of say, yeah, that's about the same time that they happened. When I first started thinking about this stuff, I don't mean to think about it deeply, but my first interaction with time on computers was when I started running Linux servers, and they would boot in the early days, and they would have an instruction, or they would have a standard out line that was like, syncing the clock, NTP, things like that. And you could actually run NTP command. I mean, you still can. I'm sure I haven't in many, many years, but this is 20 years ago. And I was like, wow, NTP, that's pretty cool. My computer could just go out and ask another computer where the time is and then make sure that its time is correct there. I don't have to like set the clock like I do on my microwave or my VCR, if you remember what that is.
I remember it well, yes.
So NTP, the guy who actually made NTP, he died this year. His name was David Mills. I looked this up. He's from the University of Delaware. He's a professor there. He designed NTP in the 70s, and they call him the internet, the father time of the internet. I looked at the Wikipedia page on NTP because I wanted to understand it a little more. I kind of knew a little bit about it. This is from Wikipedia. NTP is intended to synchronize all participating computers to within a few milliseconds of UTC. It uses the intersection algorithm, a modified version of Marzullo's algorithm, to select accurate time servers and is designed to mitigate the effects of variable network latency. NTP can usually maintain time to within tens of milliseconds over the public internet. It can achieve better than 1 millisecond accuracy in local area networks under ideal conditions. Asymmetric routes and network congestion can cause errors of 100 milliseconds or more. So it sounds like the best we can get is on a local area network, ideal conditions, 1 millisecond. Generally, you're looking at tens of milliseconds, but if things go weird, you can get errors of hundreds of milliseconds or more. I read this and I want to say to myself, can I just keep time on my own machine and not have to worry about talking on the internet to other machines?
This is very tricky. So, as we mentioned, the clock on your computer is probably going to drift a little bit. And over time, that will add up. And so the idea behind NTP is, to sort of reset your clock in very small ways so that it matches coordinated universal time.
Mm-hmm.
But as you mentioned before, you don't get the response about what time it is from the time server instantaneously.
Mm-hmm.
So, there's some amount of time it takes to send the packet. So basically what happens is you send a UDP packet to one or more time servers and they send you a response. But, there's some number of milliseconds it takes for that packet to reach the time server, some number of milliseconds it takes that packet to come back from the time server.
Mm-hmm.
And so you have to account for that latency when trying to figure out how to adjust the clock on your system.
Yeah.
Which is why it can't be, totally accurate.
Mm-hmm. It's not instantaneous. And I guess to just belabor the point, we can't just say I only care about the time on my server. You mentioned drift. It's like I can't just say, well, that's like style. I drift around the turns in a video game. That's not just the style or flavor of my machine. It's drift. I need to actually agree with some other machine on what time it is. And if you go back to the last episode, I ended up thinking about that "am I the asshole" thing a few times afterwards, because that guy in the meeting said to me, dates don't have timestamps. And I think the conclusion I came to after you and I discussed it was I need to know when my timestamp is going to be interpreted, what it's going to mean, and the meaning of it relates to the time zone I want that date to apply to. And dates do have time zones, is ultimately what I want to say. And this is all involved in this idea that I need to coordinate what happens on my machine with what happens on their machines. I don't know when their machines are going to where. I don't know where their machines are running. I don't know what time their machines think it is. And because I don't know that, I have to sort of bake in some extra information.
Yeah, and in that particular case, it's not even so when you say you don't know what time their computers think it is, it's not just because there's drift and the time gets off. It's because you don't know how they're interpreting your time.
Right.
Uh,
Right. It's the interpretation. What does it mean when I give you a timestamp? What does it mean? And the question of meaning is similar to meaning in language. If I'm just speaking to myself, that doesn't mean anything in a way. When I'm trying to communicate with you, we have to have sort of an agreed upon foundation for what things mean. And time is this incredibly important foundation because nothing means anything unless you establish time first.
yeah, and I think that was kind of the original intent behind time zones. So I read a couple of different places about the origin of time zones, and I think everybody here is probably in elementary school that they invented them so that they could help trains run a little bit more on schedule. So
I don't
prior to
remember hearing that in elementary school, but I'll take your word for it.
so this the story goes, and I don't know how much of this is apocryphal, but the story always goes that at the time when train routes were being built across the country, it was customary for towns to sort of set their own time. So
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
every town had their own version of what noon was, and so if you were traveling 200 miles by train and it took 2 hours, the local time might actually be only an hour and a half different than where you started, even though it was a 2 hour trip. And so there was apparently this dude named Sanford Fleming who was annoyed by this problem. And so he proposed this idea of setting up 24 time zones. So basically taking the whole planet and dividing it up into 15-degree chunks of latitude. And that would make 24 separate time zones. And so,
Sounds great. What could possibly go wrong?
yeah, I mean, and it's worked perfectly ever since. No
I gotta say,
complications.
the first thing that sounds kooky about this scheme is, hey, can we get everybody on the planet to agree on this one simple thing?
Yeah, that does seem, especially in our current environment, that does seem implausible. And the fact is, people really didn't. The system is in place; it works pretty well, given its limitations. But there's a lot of weirdness to it. Just like so, take into account the sort of things that we see. So we work in San Diego, but we have collaborators and users who are all over the country, maybe even all over the world. So, if somebody creates a record in a database here in San Diego, we'd probably put a time stamp on it. But if somebody's looking at that in Utah, they're in a different time zone. So they'll see the timestamp as being, an hour earlier than what we see it, which is going to be true for most people in Mountain Time Zone, except for people who live in Arizona, who don't observe daylight savings time. They're going to see it during daylight savings time. They're going to see the record with the same time as we have, even though people due north of them see it an hour later.
You're talking like if we just use local time.
When somebody sees a timestamp on something that's shown to them in a user interface, they interpret it immediately as local time.
Mm-hmm.
So, it's customary to make the display of data conform to whatever local time is, regardless of what the timestamp on the actual data record may be.
Well, and this is why it's so common for us to just save everything in UTC. UTC is flawless, Mike, right? It's perfect.
Yeah. Yeah. I don't see any issues with it.
The rub. There's the rub, my friend.
Yeah. Well, I mean, we discussed this a lot in the last episode. I guess even if UTC were perfect, there's still issues about, how do people want that to be interpreted. Like you had this issue about sending a record to somebody, and if it doesn't explicitly specify the time zone, how do you interpret that? Do you interpret that as being a UTC time? Do you interpret it as being the local time? Do you interpret it as being the local time from where it was sent? So there's that issue. And then kind of the things we talked about in the last episode where UTC itself has to be continually adjusted.
Right. Because the way in which the planet moves, which is how we really think of time fundamentally, is sloppy.
Yeah.
And the cesium clocks, they're more accurate. So you got to just sort of pause them every so often. And you have to agree on the pause in advance. You have to have a meeting of people in robes and hoods come together and in tone, in synchrony. We have determined there will be a leap second in 7 years on January 1st. And then everybody writes it down. And somehow my program has to know about that.
Yeah. One thing that I discovered in looking around for things for this episode is that the GPS system does not adjust for leap seconds.
Oh,
And so the time provided by the GPS system is actually something like 18 seconds different from universal coordinated time.
wow. It
So
seems
there's,
to be working until it doesn't, right? I read about this phrase, death by GPS. Apparently, there are people, Mike, who think we should really not get rid of, but not rely on GPS. We should become experts at orienteering. You know, one promise I had last time, though, is that we were going to talk about the falsehoods. The falsehoods article, these have been out so long that I'm sure that there are a lot of falsehoods in here, which are no longer widely held falsehoods. And in fact, these articles were so widely discussed that I think they actually moved the needle on the types of misconceptions that programmers have about time. These articles came out in 2012. I probably read them maybe 2013, 2014, about the time where I was like, I want to be a better engineer. I want to know what I don't know. I want to know the categories of things I don't know. I want to be good. I want to write good software. And I think there are things I read in Falsehoods Programmers Believe About Time. This was published in June of 2012, where I think, oh yeah, who believes that now? So like falsehoods about your system clock being accurate all the time, or uh, falsehoods about the duration of time on the system clock. These are fun to read still, but I don't know how accurate, how commonly held these are as misconceptions. But then there are a lot, I think, that are still, I read them and I'm still like, oh yeah, I guess that could happen.
yeah, there are some of them that are still puzzling and need clarification. Uh, like
Yeah,
the
they're
day
like
before Saturday is always Friday.
yeah, it's like a Zen koan or something. Like what? If you ponder this statement, you may reach enlightenment.
Yeah. Or time always goes forwards. That sounds like some profound statement of physics, but it's really just a commentary on how screwed up time is on computers.
One of the falsehoods is my software is only used internally locally, so I don't have to worry about time zones. And when I reread this list, I was like, yes, that person who told me dates don't have time zones, that person was wrong. The one about time zones is pretty good too. Here's one for you, actually, before we move on. A timestamp represents the time that an event actually occurred.
Yeah, that one I've been bitten by. There's sort of two issues there. One is how closely does the timestamp correspond to the actual thing happening? And two, how do I want to put this? There's like a common thing is that people will say, I'm going to put a field on my database that automatically timestamps this record
Whenever it's modified.
whenever it's modified or whenever it's saved.
Yeah.
What does that correspond to? Does it actually correspond to the commit of the database? Does it correspond to when the thing was changed in memory? So there's a little bit of ambiguity about what that actually means.
Mm-hmm.
The other thing I've seen is that there are some systems which sort of paradoxically things happen in one order, but then they send you timestamps that indicate a different order.
Mm.
And so there's kind of this assumption that when you get timestamps, they are really actually corresponding to the order in which things happen. So you may
Mhm.
assume that they're not exactly corresponding to the actual event, but you do at least make the assumption, or you have to make the assumption that the order in which things happened is correct, which I've seen is not always true.
Yeah. And you just sort of, by default, you start with that assumption. I see a timestamp, I accept it at face value, and then I go on this long debugging excursion. And if that timestamp's not accurate, it's actually a pretty hard thing for me to discover from where I started from. Started with this as a foundational piece of information. I think there's something else that this hints at, which is sometimes as developers, this is one of your topics too. I may be working at a layer of the stack and ignoring layers below, and that can sometimes hurt me. And this is one of those cases where I wonder if I'm writing a Python program and I import datetime, and Python standard library has a datetime, and I can say, I want a datetime, I want it to be now, and I want it to be with the time zone of UTC. Great. I've got a timestamp at some point in my program. Do I need to know at the system level how that timestamp was derived? Or can I just trust that most of the time the developers who are between me and the quote unquote real time, that they're working hard to try to get it right? Right? Do I need to know that this machine is participating in something like NTP? What if it's a virtual machine? I know Red Hat has their own like virtual machine specialized implementation of NTP, which is supposed to be super accurate. Okay, so maybe my virtual machine every so often is talking to NTP. And when I say, hey, I want a timestamp, there's a system call which goes to the adjusted clock that's in synchrony with maybe these other clocks in some way. Do I need to know that? Or can I just sort of blind? I can ignore it most of the time, probably, right?
I think you can ignore it most of the time, but I also suspect that a lot of the most difficult to diagnose and fix bugs are probably due to strange time behavior like this.
Yeah, I guess I'm just going to cross my fingers and go, this will probably work. It works for me most of the time. The problem where NTP may be slow, maybe it's using NTP, but maybe it's off by hundreds of milliseconds. That could be really problematic if I'm relying on that somehow. But then we talked a little about time zones, and time zones are wherever all bets are off. It's like, so you mentioned time zones there. When I think of time zones, I think, oh, cool. It's like longitude. So I go over enough degrees of longitude and I'm in a new time zone. But if you actually look at like time zones drawn out on the planet, they kind of go all zigzaggy and weird, and there'll be like a carve out for some islands in the Pacific.
Yeah, and I grew up in Indiana, so the two states that I spent most of my youth in were Indiana and Arizona, both of which at the time did not observe daylight savings time. Indiana, in particular, is super weird because it has parts that are both Eastern and Central time zone. So in Indiana, the area up near Chicago is carved out to be part of Central time because they associate so much more with the Chicago metropolitan area than they do with the rest of Indiana. And there's another little carve out in the bottom of the state that's also on Central time. So I think that's even one of the fallacies, maybe, is that, it's a fallacy to think that a particular state will all be in the same time zone.
I love the fallacies about time zones post. I just think it's like the whole post has, you just go, what?
Yeah, there's a few things in here where I'm like, that can't be right. That just somebody that had to be a mistake.
I want to
Uh,
talk about a couple of them. One is a country's time zone never changes. Yeah, apparently that happens where you can actually adjust the whole time zone. You could decide, yeah, we don't want to be in that time zone anymore. We're going to be in this one, which is pretty funny if you think about it, because we think of time zones as geography, but they're not even, they're just these invisible political boundaries.
yeah, there's another dimension to time zones that we don't talk about in here, which is so the actual time zone names are kept in this database by the IANA. And it's true that countries change their time zones, but it's also true that historically various places have changed their time zones. So if you're dealing with time in, say, like 1975, there may be a place that was now on one time zone, but in 1970 was on a different time zone. So you'll see these things in the IANA database. There are things like, oh, this town in Indiana decided not to observe daylight savings times in 1945. So anyway, yeah, yet another thing to deal with.
Here's the first surprising detail about time zones. You think of time zones as a UTC offset, right? So +1, -1. In California, we might be -7 or -8. Our offset is UTC of UTC. So you think, okay, we're going to break it up into 24 time zones. Okay, cool. As a programmer, I think then I've got, and UTC is Greenwich, roughly, right? Greenwich Mean Time. So England. So I can be 12 hours ahead or 12 hours behind, and that'll cover 24, right? I would hope that 12 hours ahead is the same as 12 hours behind on the globe here, if it's modulo 24. Okay, this all makes sense, right? What I'm saying so far?
It's absolutely perfectly logical, yes, but
Yeah,
also
but it does.
wrong.
Yeah, exactly. Like, it doesn't actually work that way. There are UTC offsets that go from -12 to +14. So that's a 27 hours span that you can be UTC offset by. And there is a zero offset. This is if you think to yourself, I could write my own date time library in whatever my favorite programming language is. This is the first thing that should make you a little bit nervous, a little bit scared.
Yeah, this is probably right up there with don't write your own encryption algorithms. Use a library.
Here's another one. Every UTC offset corresponds to exactly one time zone. And then the author of the post gives an example where there are 10 time zones, 10 named time zones that are all UTC +5 off of UTC. and there's like a political ramification there, right? Does Pakistan want to be on the same time zone as an island or a country that they're not associated with?
That is frustrating, but at least the different names do actually correspond to incremental hours. It's the next one that just blows my mind, in which I still don't understand.
So they're not all an hour off of UTC. India Standard Time is 5.5 hours off of UTC. I remember I was in India and we were on the west coast of India. This was in 2000, and I needed to fly out of the east coast of India. And the name of the town was, maybe it'll come to me. And so I was in a travel agent's office, and it was at nighttime. We needed to make sure that my flight was still going to happen.
So
And this isn't.
I wanted to interject there for our younger listeners. A travel agent was a human being who worked kind of like TripAdvisor.
So that's true. Yeah, we had human beings. Chennai, that was the city, right? So I had to fly out of Chennai, but I was on the west coast of India. So we're in this travel agent's office because apparently that's the easiest. So there's not a lot of internet around India at that time. So I couldn't just go on the internet and be like, is my flight still happening? We had to go to a travel agent. And travel agent, he's like, oh, I will call the airport in Chennai and see if your flight is still happening. And this is at night. And I just sort of blurted out, oh, what time is it there? Are they still open? And he looked at the clock, and the clock said, it said something like 7:15. And when I said, what time is it there? The look on his face was like, why'd you ask such a bizarre and absurd question? It is a big country. And when I asked it, what time is it there? He went, it's probably 7:38. He just pulled a number out of a hat. Like, that was like 20 minutes ahead. And I went, oh, okay, got it. I'll trust you. You know what you're doing. And he called them, and they picked up the phone, and they said, yeah, your flight's still happening tomorrow. So India, 5.5 hours off of UTC. You think, okay, cool. So maybe it's not on the hour. I could write my program so that it's every half hour. And the fallacies about time zones, like, wait. Nepal likes to be at the 45-minute offset. And you think, why in the world would Nepal pick that? And it's because there's a particular mountain, and they want the sun to be above that mountain at noon.
Yeah. I guess I feel fortunate that I've never had to deal with customers in Nepal.
Yeah, but I hear that, and I think there's something really beautiful about that. That's totally reasonable to me. They want the sun to be above the mountain at noon. That's cool.
That is a pretty good excuse. Yeah, I confess.
Yeah. So I need to write a program where the bank releases funds to my customer in Nepal at noon. Here's the problem. How does my program know when the sun is over the mountain?
Yeah, so time zones. This is why programmers ask dumb questions when people ask them to write software that seem to do simple things.
Yeah, this is why people hate us, Mike. People hate us at work because we ask them all the questions about this stuff.
Should we talk about leap seconds?
We did last time. We want to talk about them again?
So I think the only reason I want to talk about leap seconds is because I discovered this other interesting thing. The leap second is usually handled by NTP also.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I was surprised by that, actually.
And I guess the sort of normal way is to just literally adjust when you get this message about a leap second, you just adjust your clock by a second.
Mm-hmm.
But apparently, some places, in particular Google, do a thing where they sort of add the second over a 24-hour period, and they call that leap smearing.
I thought leap smearing was like a skin facial treatment.
It could be that too. Yeah.
Mm.
I just wanted to say leap smearing. I don't know how relevant that factoid is. Another good factoid about time zones, which we found, was that so you think of time zones, they're based on longitude. So you're sort of dividing the planet up into orange slices.
Mm-hmm.
But if you think about that, that means that the time zones actually get closer and closer together the further north and south you go.
Right.
And
so my foot could be in multiple time zones if I'm standing on the South Pole or something, right?
yeah, so if you're exactly at the South Pole or North Pole, you're sort of effectively in all the time zones.
I
So
thought that's what physicists call superposition.
no, I don't think that's what physicists call superposition. But
okay, I had that wrong.
In any case, apparently scientists at the poles just use UTC because they don't really have a time zone to work in.
Well, that's great. All my programs, all the timestamps are in UTC.
Yeah. I think just everybody should follow polar time.
So, but they probably have to have some pretty crazy NTP stuff going on there because most of their computers are not that close to the rest of the world's computers, I would guess.
Yeah, they're most likely talking directly to satellites, I would think.
Yeah, that makes sense. Well, Mike, this started with me waking up to my alarm clock and complaining about that, and ended with much fun and hilarity around timestamps and time zones. I respect that Nepalese have the sun over the mountain right at noon. I really like that. I think there is a fundamental thing here, which is our programs just cannot capture certain human behaviors, right? We just sort of approximate stuff.
I think it's partially human behavior, and it's also one of the effects of human behavior is that we need time zones because everybody wants the sun to come up in the morning. You know, everybody wants it to be 6 a.m. or 7 a.m. or whatever when the sun comes up, and not, 7 a.m. in New York and 11 a.m. in California or whatever. That's one human quirk. But also, I think there's this kind of issue where we're trying to wrap this sort of precise geometrical interpretation around our astronomical phenomenon, which are not cooperative. You know, they don't want to work in exactly whole number divisions of things. So kind of a leaky abstraction sort of idea.
Yeah. That's why I respect the Nepalese, because it's like, I want the sun to be right overhead at noon. I get that. And everybody wants that.
We should do that in California just to be annoying. We should adjust our time zone so that the sun hits El Capitan with just the right alpenglow at the sunset. So
that's why they call it the dawn wall.
Right.
Yeah. All right, Mike. Thanks for talking to me again about time. I hope this is a fun conversation to hear, but also illuminating. What is it? I don't know if it's going to be.
I think of it as just like a way for us to complain about why time is annoying. And hopefully, some people who don't have to deal with annoying time will have some sympathy for us.
Yeah, maybe the next time someone at work gives me that face, why are you asking me all these dumb questions about when it's going to be a month from now? I could just point to this episode and be like, it's not me being annoying. There are hard things here. We need to mention a thing I continually forget to mention. If you would like to contact us, you can send us email at podcast@picturemecoding.com. We also have a Blue Sky account. Mike, what's the Blue Sky account?
Picture me coding at
Oh,
bski.io or whatever.
okay. So it's not a surprising, unrelated thing. It's the name
No.
of the podcast.
Yeah, and there's like 20 million people in Blue Sky now, so I know that there's some of you out there. So go look us up.
20 million people. There may be a listener of our podcast. And you can also get a mug or a sticker if you want at our Threadless store. Picture Me Coding. I will include a link to that in our notes for the show. Thanks so much, Mike. We'll see you again next week.
See you next time.
Bye-bye.